So, Ambassador, thanks for talking to us today. Yesterday, a senior Ukrainian security official said his government expects a major Russian offensive within the coming months, if not the next 2 or 3 weeks. What kind of escalation can we expect, do you think?
Well, this isn't too hard to predict. If you look at just the conditions on the ground and the weather, I think many people expect both the Russians and the Ukrainians to have some sort of spring offensive. We're at a moment right now where both sides are still fighting, but I think the way we would describe it right now is they're kind of stuck in neutral. There are little bits of victories each and every day coming from either side, but in terms of a big emboldened move on the part of the Ukrainians or the Russians, I think we can anticipate that when the ground isn't frozen and when the weather conditions get a bit better. So as you have heard in recent days and weeks, what the alliance is doing, individual members of the alliance, is ensuring that we get as much equipment in the hands of the Ukrainian military as possible so that they could be ready for any coming offensive.
So, the Russians will go up a gear. What kind of gear will they go up to? Is it going to be a multi-front attack, do you think? And how many troops are they going to throw into this war, do you think?
It's hard to predict exactly what the Russians have up their sleeve and what they're planning. If I were them, I'd certainly be looking at the whole array of challenges that they've had over the last year. They know that they have major challenges when it comes to command and control, but also logistics, and that's been apparent from day one since the war started. So obviously, from a Russian perspective, they want to see if they can hold the territory that they've been able to seize to date, but they also have to face the reality that they haven't been able to achieve their strategic objectives on the ground.
Can we expect another attack on Kyiv, do you think, from the Russians?
I don't think anybody sees that coming, at least for now. I mean, they tried very hard to do that at the beginning of the war, and it was apparent that there was no way that they were going to be able to meet that objective. So we'll have to see. Again, it's hard to predict. The war takes different turns depending on the week and month. But right now, I suspect that they want to hang on to that territory in the east and the south.
It's hard to predict, but presumably you're seeing what the Ukrainians are seeing over the border. How many troops are massing? What kind of arms and armour?
Well, the Ukrainians are monitoring very closely whether or not they're going to move any new equipment inside Ukraine. They're obviously trying to predict whether or not the Russians are going to go forward with an additional round of mobilizations. That was the decision that they took last year. The question is, do they need additional forces on top of the mobilization that they activated a couple of months back? So I will leave it to the Ukrainians to keep a close, watchful eye on what's happening in terms of how Russians are preparing. But again, our focus is on helping the Ukrainians be at the ready for any future contingency.
Yeah, but to be in that position, I mean, I suppose what I'm getting at is, yes, we can expect the Russians to up the ante once the weather improves, but on what kind of scale do you think they're going to launch this new offensive at?
Well, it's hard to predict. The reality is that they have real challenges. They do not have the forces that they need. These guys that are coming into the conflict we've seen in recent months are not adequately trained. And the reality is that they're facing their own munition shortages, that they are running out of PGMs. So this is not a situation where the Russians have an endless supply of either equipment or manpower. And so they're going to have to be grappling with those challenges in real time for any counteroffensive that we're going to see them pursue this spring.
So not much of a threat then if they've got all these reduced capabilities?
We will see. We will see. Again, it's hard to predict. Nobody has a crystal ball. But what we have seen is the Ukrainians' ability to pursue these counteroffensive and have success on the battlefield.
But the Russians are mobilising tens of thousands of soldiers. And as we've seen in Solidar and Bakhmut, they're prepared to send over wave after wave of troops. How big a problem is that going to be for the Ukrainians?
Well, it's clear that the Russians are trying to throw mass at the problem, but that doesn't make up for quality. There's quantity in the quality equation here, and they can throw a lot of manpower at the problem, but as we just mentioned, or as I just mentioned, it's tough given the lack of training and the lack of capabilities that these troops face.
But it could come in the next few weeks. Would you agree with that? 2 or 3 weeks, possibly?
Well, honestly, we don't know. I think there is an expectation that the spring will bring a change, and we'll have to see what that actually transpires, how that transpires.
And will the hesitation over sending tanks, will that have cost Ukraine in terms of its capability? will they have these tanks in time for that Russian offensive?
I think the goal is, first and foremost, to get the training underway as soon as humanly possible, and that has started happening. So first and foremost, we've got to train them up on the tanks that are going to be coming in, and then we need to rapidly move those tanks and get them in the hands of military commanders on the ground. I think everyone across the alliance appreciates that time is of the essence. We appreciate the urgency of the situation, and the goal seems to be a shared one, not only across the Ramstein group, which is the group of countries that meets monthly to talk about Ukraine's military requirements, but also across the NATO alliance.
The Ukrainians are saying it could come within the next 2 or 3 weeks. So these tanks are not going to get there in time for that, are they?
I think it depends how fast we can train them up on, and how, I mean, the one thing that's been unbelievable over the last year is the Ukrainian military's ability to train up on equipment and utilize it in real time. I mean, the way they have condensed the period of training that is often required for the systems that we have given them has been nothing short of remarkable. So let's see how this proceeds. But again, I think it's clear that those countries donating the tanks right now fully appreciate the urgency.
Military experts seem to think that tanks, modern battle tanks, are no use without air cover and modern fighter jets. Why is your government not prepared to send those?
Well, the president's answer was no. He was asked this question directly. Right now, the United States has no decision to share as it relates to aircraft or F-16s. But I think fundamentally, as we've seen throughout this war, there are a couple of hard questions you have to ask yourself before you provide any individual asset to Ukraine. You have to think about not only the training piece, but you also have to think about the logistics tail. You have to think about maintenance and spare parts. And so any asset that's given to the Ukrainians has to have a series of questions answered. We also have to have a full understanding of the Ukrainian forces' ability to absorb those assets and use them in real time. And so you also heard President Biden say that he's going to have a conversation with President Zelensky. We are in regular contact with the Ukrainians to talk about their military requirements, and we'll continue to engage them in a conversation.
We heard very similar things from officials like yourself talking about tanks, and then finally America is giving tanks. And the argument is that the alliance is giving Ukraine just enough to continue this war, but not to win it. Why not give them everything they need to finish the war off?
I think what Western countries and what other countries around the world have given the Ukrainian military forces has been astounding. When you think about where this war started, how we were all focused on javelins and stingers, and then moved to munition shortages over the summer. We had a period where we were talking about coastal defense, and now we're very focused not only on armor, but on artillery. We're looking at ammunition, and we continue to look at air defense. I think it is a full package of assets that many countries have come together to provide to the Ukrainians, and it has had a real and lasting impact on the battlefield.
But the problem is, once again, you're one stage behind what the Ukrainians say they need. They say they need fighter jets now, and you're not prepared to send them.
Well, as I said, with each asset, you have to go through a series of questions. This isn't a case where you can just snap your fingers and suddenly send fighter jets if the Ukrainians don't have the pilots at the ready, if they haven't answered the logistics question, how to maintain these types of assets. So this has been an evolution. You're absolutely right. We have been in regular contact with the Ukrainians to hear from them in real time what their requirements are. Honestly, those requirements have changed. They did not start out asking for F-16s. We are now at a point where we're engaged in that type of conversation, and we'll see where that takes us. But I don't think it's fair to say at any given point the requirements have been stagnant. I mean, their requirements have changed based on what Russia's doing on the ground and what their needs are on the battlefield.
Well, they say their requirements have changed, and what they need now is fighter jets, and that Poland and Holland are beginning to think about sending them. Why isn't America as well?
Well, we leave it in the hands of every country to determine what they want to give to Ukraine. We're not in a position to dictate that, so we'll let the Poles and other countries determine what they want to provide Ukraine. You heard our president. I think his answer was very clear.
I mean, why? If I could put the criticism again, the criticism is that you're giving them enough to continue the war, not to win it. Why not give them what they need right now to finish the job off?
I think you're underestimating the real victories that they've had on the battlefield. I mean, they were able to push the Russians away from Kyiv, which was their original objective. And then when Russia went forward and had its attempted and illegal annexation of 4 different corners of Ukraine, the Ukrainians then went in and successfully were able to retake that territory. So they've had remarkable success on the battlefield. I wouldn't want to undersell that. And we will do all we can to ensure that that continues.
They have, but the Russians are now succeeding in places like Soledar, and the Ukrainians now say they expect a major offensive that they won't be able to repel unless they get more weapons.
Well, we want to ensure that we can help the Ukrainians with their own counteroffensive that will come later this year.
And can the alliance keep up with the pace of armament production, supplying enough shells in particular and artillery pieces to the Ukrainians?
So there's 2 problems, 2 challenges. One, we want to make sure that the declining stocks that exist inside Ukraine are adequately addressed by the 50 countries that are now providing security assistance. And we're working on that through this Ramstein group that meets on a monthly basis. There's another challenge, and that is individual NATO allies that are providing security assistance are also now starting to experience declining stocks. And so as an alliance, we have to come together and talk about how we can pursue multinational buys, pooled buys to address some of those gaps that now exist because of the assistance that's flowing into Ukraine. So NATO as an alliance is taking this on for how it relates to NATO members. And then the Ramstein group, the 50 countries providing assistance, is looking at the shortfalls on the Ukrainian side.
The senior Ukrainian official yesterday said to us that he expects the worst is yet to come, despite everything we've seen last year. Do you expect worse to come this year?
Look, I mean, one thing that's been very clear over this last year is that no one has a crystal ball. No one can predict the way in which this is going to unfold. What we can predict is that Russians will continue pushing. They're trying to defend the territory that they've taken, but I think it's safe to predict that the Ukrainians are going to do everything they can to retake that territory. And again, our goal is to support them as they defend their territory and their sovereignty against this Russian aggression.
Let me ask you one about British defence funding, because earlier this week the Defence Secretary Ben Wallace said that Britain's defence has been underfunded for decades. How big a worry is that for you, that a key member of the alliance, its military is being underfunded?
Well, I'll tell you how we look at it. We look at the United Kingdom and we see that we have no closer ally, bilateral ally, than the United Kingdom. Why do we say that? Because the United Kingdom is incredibly capable. It's a committed ally. We work closely together, not only in NATO, but in a lot of other multilateral institutions, and we work together bilaterally on a whole array of challenges, whether it's defense issues, tech issues, climate change. So we view the United Kingdom as one of our closest bilateral partners, and that's the bottom line.
But is it a worry that its military isn't getting the money that its own defence secretary says it needs?
Well, you heard the UK's defence secretary talk about the fact that the United Kingdom is going to be making additional investments in their armed forces, and I'll leave it to him to comment on the state of the British armed forces. But he seemed to acknowledge that they would be making additional investments there, and that's something that we would applaud and welcome.
Is it a worry for you that with the anniversary coming up, and there seems to be a worry for the Ukrainians, they will use this, the Russians, as a date on which they stage some kind of attempt at a comeback?
Well, what we want to do on the anniversary is herald the support and unity that we've been able to maintain for the last year. President Putin was sure that transatlantic unity would crumble. He was sure that there would be cracks as early as last fall as we moved into the winter months. I think the prediction was that the alliance couldn't hold, but the reality is the alliance is holding. There's no crack in alliance unity. Do we have debates and differences inside the NATO alliance? Absolutely. regularly, each and every day, we debate a variety of issues tied to Ukraine. But despite those differences, the fact that we're still standing in support of Ukraine after a year, I think should come as a surprise to President Putin and should concern him, because I don't see any sign that individual member states are heading for the exits.
Well, you had major differences over tanks, and that was public and for everyone to see. And you may have them over fighter jets as well. And the worry is, I guess, that is going to cost the Ukrainians lives, and may have already cost lives over tanks in particular if this offensive happens before the tanks can get there in time.
We have differences all the time across the NATO alliance. We have 75 years of experience in dealing with our differences. I'm confident that whatever differences we'll continue to have, we will resolve, we will work through those differences. The important fact here is that Ukraine is going to be getting those armored vehicles and the tanks in the not too distant future, and that the alliance was able to showcase, again, unity despite the differences leading up to those decisions.
And one last important question. We've heard a lot from the Russians in terms of nuclear saber rattling, that the threat of using tactical nuclear weapons. Has that receded now, do you think?
Well, we've obviously looked at the nuclear saber rattling with great concern. You've heard that our government has messaged Moscow on this. We've warned them about the consequences of relying on their nuclear arsenal. But I think what we have seen, or what we haven't seen, is really any indication in recent months that they're preparing to use nuclear weapons. So we'll continue messaging them about the dangers and the risks of doing that. We take it seriously, but I think right now we're reassured that we're not seeing an indication that they're going to make a move in that regard.
Ambassador, thank you very much.
Thank you.